the hand of God. God is the potter. And Isaiah said in Isaiah 64 verses 8 says that we are the work of the hand. Isaiah 64 verse 8. We are the work. We are the work of God. We are his own handwork. He has created us as a clay. What is a clay? The clay that we find outside, like sand. So we are a sand in his hand. He molds us into that person that he wants us to be. He designs us. He shapes our life in whichever way he desires and make us that person he wants us to be. Makes us to live to fulfill that destiny he has created for us to fulfill on earth. So we are a clay in the hand of the potter. God is the potter. Now, that is the clue number one. That's the first clue as to why should God allow us to suffer. Now, you must understand this again. You and I are clays in the hand of the potter. God is the potter and we are the clay. The potter molds the clay. The potter designs the clay to suit his own taste, to suit his desire, to suit his plan before he even started molding that clay. So we are a clay in God's hand. So it's a clue to why we suffer, why the righteous suffer. It's a clue to why his saints go through adversities, trials, and challenges in life. That's a clue. Now, the second clue is, why do we then have to suffer? That's the question. Why do you and I have to suffer? Why should a merciful, righteous, holy God allow me and you to suffer? Why should we go through adversities in life? Why should we walk through the wilderness? Why should we be left in the storms of life to suffer? That's the question now you will ask. If you are a clay, you agree with me, you are a clay in the hand of God, who is the potter. It means as a clay, the potter's function is to design the clay, is to mold the clay into his own desire. The clay has to meet his own plan, the potter's plan, the purpose of the potter for the clay. His design has to meet that purpose. So suffering comes into our life because we are a clay, and God being the potter, he uses suffering to mold, design our life to meet his own requirement, his own program and agenda for us on earth. God cannot mold a clay that he has not created. But because God has created all things, everything that you see with your eyes are clay in the hand of God. So God has created the trees to meet a specific need and purpose on earth. God has created the seas, the rivers, the mountains, the rocks for a purpose. God created sun, God created moon, God created star for a purpose. So all these things I've mentioned are firmaments of nature that God has created for a purpose, and they are all clays in the hand of God, being the potter. That is what Isaiah chapter 64 verses 8 is telling us this hour, that we are all clays. Everything you see, the building you live in, the car you drive, the clothes, everything is a clay. God has created all of these things, including the breath in man. That means creationism. God has created man to meet a specific purpose, a specific plan, agenda on earth. Now, God uses suffering. God allows suffering. God uses suffering as a tool and equipment, like the potter. If you have visited a potter's house before, where people who are artistic in nature, people that have this creative ability. I have once visited a potter, people that mold pots, plates, kettles, cups. I have had that opportunity to visit a potter's house before, and I now see what they do. You see them with their tools. Some tools, chisels. Most of the tools are like a chisel. They use these chisels to cut the clay, cut it into shape, cut it, mold it, drop it, chisel it again, cut this clay, cut it, they continue to mold it until that kettle comes up with a specific shape that they have in their mind. They have a shape in their mind. They come up with this specific shape. Now, when the potter gets that specific shape of the kettle, the cup, the pots, the plates, or whatever it is designing, tables, chair, whatever he feels like, when he gets that shape, he becomes satisfied. Now, the chisel in the hand of the potter that the potter uses to shapen his clay into the shape, that desired shape that he needs, that chisel is called suffering. Are you with me, brothers and sisters? The chisel is called suffering. So the suffering that you and I go through, that is the chisel that God uses to mold us into that person he wants us to be. He uses the chisel. Suffering is the chisel to cut through our body, cut through our flesh. It continues to reshape our destinies, reshape our lives, reshape our thoughts, reshape our visions, reshape our mindsets until we conform to that plan and purpose for which we are created for. Now, if we don't conform to God's plan and purpose, the chisel in the hand of God, which is suffering, God continues to use that chisel to cut until he gets that shape, that desired shape that he has purposed for us even before we were created. God creates us and creates a destiny for you and I to go and fulfill. Now, each time we walk away from our destinies, God uses suffering to draw us back into that line of fulfilling that call and destiny that he has created for us on earth. Suffering is not a punishment. I want you to listen to this, children of God. Suffering is not a punishment. When you suffer, it doesn't mean God is punishing you. When you suffer, it doesn't mean God hates you. When you suffer, it doesn't mean God does not like you. When you suffer in life, it doesn't mean God has forgotten you. When you suffer in life, it doesn't mean you are rejected by God. I will give you examples in the Bible of suffering that shows God's sovereignty. It reveals God's love and righteousness and holiness in our life. Suffering should not be rejected. Suffering should not be hated. Suffering should not be abhorred. In as much as it brings pain, unbearable pain upon our life, is a chisel in the hand of God. He is the potter. You and I are the clay in his hand. Suffering is the chisel. God uses chisel to continue to mold, cut through our destinies, cut through our life, cut through our vision. Chisel God uses to cut through our dreams. God uses chisel to cut through our heart desires and everything that is pertaining to us until we conform to his plan and purpose for our lives on earth. Suffering should not be hated. Suffering should not be rejected. It is not a sign of hatred from God. It's not a sign of dislike. It's not a sign of rejection. It is a sign of God's righteousness. God uses suffering to shape you and me to conform to his plan and purpose for us on earth. Now listen to this again. Suffering reveals God's sovereignty. I want to show you that in the Bible. If you open to the book of Genesis chapter 45, I'm going to read it very quickly. Genesis chapter 45, you will see what suffering does. Chapter 45, I'm just going to read from verses 4. Genesis chapter 45 from verses 4. Now I read. And the Bible says, I'm talking about why the righteous and merciful God, why does he allow his saints, his people to suffer? Why does God allow you and me to suffer? Why do we have to suffer? If we love God, we serve God in truth and in spirit, why do we suffer? That's the question. Why? And a lot of people all over the world are asking this same question: why should I suffer on earth? Why? That's the question. Why must I be suffering on earth? I go to church, I give offering, I give tithes, I serve God, I arrange the church, I am an errand girl, I'm an errand boy in the ministry, I preach the gospel, I travel for evangelical purposes, but yet I suffer while serving God. Now the question is, why do you suffer? If you serve God, you love God, you worship God, you do everything that is right before God, yet you suffer, why must a righteous God allow his saints to suffer? I have said it again, and I'll say it again: suffering is not a sign of God's hatred for you. Suffering is not a sign of God's dislike or abhorrence for you. Suffering is not a sign of God's rejection for you. Suffering is a sign of God's righteousness and holiness. He reveals his righteousness and holiness through suffering. Now remember, Isaiah, where we read earlier, 64 verse 8, makes it very clear we are a clay in the hand of God, and God is a potter. And I gave you an example of a potter and a clay. A potter molds the clay. A clay in the hand of a potter. A potter has a design in heart, what he wants the clay to become, what he wants the clay to look like. The potter has a vision in heart. He has a dream in heart, what exactly he wants his clay to look like. So also are we in the hand of God. As clays, God, before he created us, before we came into this world, he had already created a destiny for you and I to go and fulfill. Now, suffering is the chisel. Just like a potter uses a chisel to chisel the clay. He wants to mold a kettle, for instance. A potter wants to mold a pot, for instance, or he wants to mold a plate, for instance. He uses a chisel to chisel that pot. He continues to cut through that clay until that clay looks exactly like the design that he originally had in his heart before he began the chiseling of the clay. So also are we, his people, God's people, in the hand of God. As the potter, he uses chisel, which is suffering, to chisel our desires, to chisel our dreams, to chisel our vision, to chisel our heart desire, until he chisels everything that is that pertains to us, and we now become or conform to exactly what he has originally planned for you and I. Let's look at Genesis very quickly. I'm talking about why should the righteous suffer. If you are a righteous man or woman watching this program, you may be asking, why should I suffer? Genesis chapter 45 verses 4. I'm going to read it. Genesis 45. And Joseph said unto his brethren, come near to me, I pray you. And they came near, and he said to them, I am Joseph your brother, whom ye sold to Egypt. Amen. Whom ye sold to where? Egypt. Whom ye sold to Egypt. Verse 5 says, and therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves, that you sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. Did you see? Joseph said to his brothers, I know you are angry because you sold me into slavery. But Joseph now told his brother, but why would you be angry? Genesis 45 verses 5. He said, because God sent me before you to preserve life. Let's look at verse 6. For these 2 years had the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 more years of famine, in which there shall neither be hearing nor harvest. Verse 7. And God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity. Listen to that. God sent me, Joseph, before you, my brothers, to preserve posterity on earth. Amen. This is verse 7. And to save your lives by a great deliverance. Now, imagine what happened to Joseph. But Joseph told his own family, his brothers and sisters, who first of all took the coats of many color from him that his father bought for him, the same brothers who threw him in the pit to die, the same brothers who took him out of the pit, sold him to Ishmaelite traders as a slave boy, the same traders sold him to the house of Potiphar, and the house of